Well, our question tonight, we put it on the screen here so you can see it. And it is, does the Bible teach communism, socialism? What about capitalism? A lot of isms there. And we want to talk about that tonight and maybe also next Wednesday night as well. The difference between the terms communism and socialism are not clear-cut. They're often used interchangeably. For example, though the Soviet Union was dominated by the Communist Party, the USSR stood for the Union of Soviet Socialist Republic. That was part of their name. Communism and socialism both rose out of protests against the exploiting of the working class during the Industrial Revolution. It was in 1875 that Karl Marx, the founder, coined the phrase that summarizes communism, and he said it like this: from each according to his ability, to each according to his needs. So it doesn't matter how much ability you have, you're still only going to get according to your needs. And under that system, the government controls everything. They take what you have and provide what they think you need, and there is no private ownership of property. So that's communism. Other examples which we might mention, and we'll put these on the screen as we make a list. These are all taken from Wikipedia. I should have put that on there, but I'll tell you. It says Cuba is a socialist democracy with the Communist Party of Cuba as the leading force of society. So they're using the terms together. Here's this one about North Korea. The politics of North Korea takes place within the framework of the official state philosophy, Juche, the belief that only through self-reliance and a strong independent state can true socialism be achieved. So, communist country trying to achieve socialism. Let's look at another one. The Communist Party of China maintains that China is not a capitalist country because the party retains control over the direction of the country, maintaining its course of socialist development. That's what their goal is, socialism. There's this one. Vietnam is known as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So, socialism figures in very prominently with communism. We recognize that it comes in degrees, but one of the things we notice here is that the more powerful the government is, the more restrictions on the people, the less freedom that you have. For example, in communist China, for a long time, there's been a limit on the number of children. You could only have one child, and anybody caught having more was subject to severe penalty. There were forced abortions. There was social engineering, and it got out of control, where they had a lot more males who reached maturity than females. They had a lot more boys than they did girls, and it created a lot of social problems because of their social engineering. Atheism is the official stance in communism. There's not room for religion. They don't want you putting anything before communism. Anything that you've got doesn't come before communism. So no room for God. So as we think about all these terms, and incidentally, there's the term Nazi, which is an abbreviation for National Socialism. That's what that means. So several countries in South America, also in Europe, claim to be socialistic. They're at different spectrums. We understand that. But most communist countries have the term socialist in their name or in their important documents. Socialism, as we mentioned, is a little bit harder to define. It usually comes incrementally, as we said, in degrees. It's an economic system in which everybody in society equally owns the factors of reproduction. Leaders are elected, and economic output is distributed according to each person's ability and his level of contribution. It was in 1980 that the author and socialist, Gregory Paul, he paraphrased Karl Marx. He paraphrased Marx, and according to the phrase used to describe socialism, he said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his contribution. Now, Karl Marx viewed socialism as an economic transition to communism. It was a stair step. It was the next step toward communism. And so he viewed it as a step between, socialism as a step between capitalism and communism. But in the free enterprise system, sometimes called private enterprise, capitalism as we know it, is it in harmony with the Scripture? If it's not right to own property and dispose of it according to your own judgment, then the free enterprise system is impossible. But if there is the right to private ownership, then the free enterprise system naturally follows that. We want to notice some religious leaders say capitalism is out of harmony with the Scripture, and they maintain that the land and the tools of production ought to be controlled and operated by the government for the good of the people. That's what they say. Instead of production and distribution having its origin with the individual, they believe it should come from the state, and they should be in control of it. Instead of the individual have the freedom to work where he wants to and choosing his own property and to buy it and to sell it as he sees fit, they believe that everything ought to be under centralized control and the bigger government, oversight of the government. Now, the individuals who maintain that we ought to have such a planned society don't deal with two very fundamental problems which this system won't solve. In fact, it will aggravate the system. It'll wreck their system and hurt the very people they're claiming they want to help. We want to point that out first. They don't show how the transfer of power from the hands of the many to the hands of the few who are in charge will work such an intellectual revolution. And secondly, how the few who control everything are going to rightly administer the things for the good of all. Along with that, the mere transfer of property and the means of production from control of the many to the control of the few who run the government will not work a moral revolution for the few who are in charge and to keep them from exploiting the people. That happens in a lot of those countries, and so it's not shown why a few who have no competitors and against whose decision there is no appeal, how that's going to work out for anybody's good, for the good of the community. And against those decisions, when they're unjust, in a capitalist society, there is a court of appeal. Communist countries don't have that. You can't appeal something to the government. They've made the decision. You don't have any decision-making right, and that's true in much of socialism as well. We want to point out that in 2017, Professor Stephen Kotkin wrote in the Wall Street Journal that communists killed at least 65 million people between 1917 and 2017. I've seen even larger numbers than that. He says, though communism has killed huge numbers of people intentionally, even more of its victims died from starvation as a result of its cruel projects of social engineering. So when we think of the names Karl Marx, V.I. Lenin, Joseph Stalin, other men like that who were early leaders of the communist movement, and their names associated with it, we can understand more, and we can read about that in history. Now, as we point out further, this lesson is not intended to defend all that every individual in our capitalist society has done or is doing. I don't defend all that some professed Christians say or do in the name of Christ. My purpose is not to maintain that Christianity can't exist under any other system. I'm not saying that. It can. In fact, Christianity was born when a dictator was in power. So we want to keep that in mind. It's my conviction that our system of private enterprise has provided the best possible environment for Christianity to grow and spread, for the gospel to be preached. And that's the point that we're making tonight. So in speaking of this system called capitalism or free enterprise, we don't have in mind just a few big businessmen. That's not what we're talking about. Also included in that are millions of farmers who in many cases own their own land and their own tools and their own means of production. So we're talking about them. We're talking about millions of small businesses. We're not just talking about big factories and things like that. We're talking about homeowners. We're talking about stock owners who draw interest on their money that they have invested. And industry shouldn't be classified as representing the rich for about 3 reasons we want to point out. One of them is its ownership is broad. Many individuals who are not wealthy own small portions of companies in their 401ks. They may own a stock here and a stock there of a particular company. They're not wealthy. That's just part of their retirement program. And there are industries which are in debt. We need to think about that. So they have to share also in the loss as well. And then we want to point out that the net capital is not hidden somewhere. It's put back into the business to help produce more goods for more people. So we're noticing some differences here. And it's not the purpose of Christianity to present a blueprint, either politically or economically, that kind of a system, but rather Christianity is worldwide in nature. And Christ gave his disciples a commission to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. So it's not tied to any kind of a system like that. It calls on men to return to God and to do that through Christ, regardless of the system under which they live. And so with that in mind, the free enterprise system is far from being anti-Christianity. It's the farthest from being anti-Christianity. It's more in harmony with the high ethical demands of Christianity. And we're going to be noticing that from the Scriptures, more so than any collectivist alternative that we can think of, whether it be socialism or communism. And so this claim can be substantiated along 3 distinct lines that we want to point out, lines of thought. First of all, with a view of the right of private property. We're going to talk about that from the Scriptures. And then with a view of the protection of the human personality, in other words, the right to life, which is guaranteed in our legal documents, that we are endowed by our Creator with certain inalienable rights, the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then third, with a view of preserving liberty, we're going to talk about that. So stated different, every collectivist society that we're talking about, system, is an attack on all 3 of those. And so we want to look at this further. So as we look at our next chart, we want to point out that private property in the Bible, in the Old Testament, first of all, we want to look at it. We read about Abraham in Genesis chapter 23 that negotiated to purchase a piece of land as a burial plot for his wife Sarah. And so Abraham had his own money, another man had some property, and they were able to exchange money for property. It didn't belong to the state or to the government, but it was something they were able to negotiate between themselves. When we read about Jacob in the Old Testament, we read about him also in the book of Genesis, beginning at chapter 30. He worked for his father-in-law, Laban, for his wages. He got a wage for what he earned. Although he had difficulty with Laban, it wasn't due to the system. It wasn't the fault of the system. It was more the fault of the fact that Laban was twice his father-in-law, the father of Leah and Rachel. So it could have been due to that fact. But we know that Jacob left with his own property a lot more than he came with. He earned it over that period of time, and he worked, and he had a right to it, and he took it with him. And the right to ownership of property was so sacred that even a king that we read about in the Old Testament didn't have the right to force an individual to sell a vineyard that he really wanted really badly. And we're talking about King Ahab and his evil wife Jezebel, who tried to take it into their own hands, and they were punished for obtaining the property of another man named Naboth by foul means. He refused to sell the property. He didn't want to sell it. It had been a part of his family, in his family heritage. He wasn't obligated to sell it, but they tried to force that. And they were severely reprimanded and punished for that in the end. And you read about that over in 1 Kings in chapter 21, an interesting account there of how they were held accountable. You may remember that when God gave Israel the promised land, He didn't set up a socialist or a communist state of some kind, but one in which private ownership of property, flocks and lands, which were their principal means of production, those were strictly guarded. There were a whole series of laws that we can read about back there in Deuteronomy and several other Old Testament passages that they had to abide by. There were certain landmarks that they were to put up to determine one person's property from another, and also their crops and as well as their animals. One was not to covet his neighbor's house. You mean a neighbor could own a house? Yes, he could. He could own a house. You weren't to covet his neighbor's house or his flocks or anything that is your neighbor's. That was the 10th commandment, including his wife, Exodus chapter 20 and verse 17. Another commandment in chapter 20 and verse 25, thou shalt not steal. That implies that ownership of property is not wrong. And if theft is wrong, then the institution of property must be right. Otherwise, if everything belongs to the state, you're not stealing from anybody else. Nothing belongs to you. It all belongs to the state. It's all community property controlled by the government, if that's the case. But let's notice also that the right of private property, and we'll scroll down here, we mentioned Naboth. We want to mention in the New Testament as well that the right of private property is also upheld in the New Testament. Thou shalt not steal is repeated at least twice in the New Testament, by Jesus one time in Matthew 19 and verse 18, and by Paul in Romans 13 and verse 9. We can read it there. In the 4th chapter of Acts, we read about Barnabas, who owned the piece of land. He decided to sell it and take the money and bring it and lay it at the apostles' feet. It was totally his decision. It wasn't a government decision. Nobody compelled him to do that. He did that out of the goodness of his own heart. And the right to own or sell property is clearly stated in the next chapter, Acts 5 and verse 4. You remember the story about Ananias and Sapphira who lied to God about a gift that they had given. And you remember what Peter said to Ananias? While it remained, was it not thine own? And after it was sold, was it not in thine own power? So, Ananias and Sapphira owned the property. They had a right to sell it for a certain amount. They had, even after they sold it, the money still belonged to them. And their sin there wasn't involved with stealing. It was with lying and hypocrisy, because they lied and pretended that they gave more than what they did, apparently wanting to look good in the eyes of others. But they were punished for that, not for owning or selling property. They had a right to do that. Now, what about the case of the rich young ruler? Sometimes that case comes up, and we want to discuss it. Does it show that it's wrong to have possessions? You remember the story. This man came to Jesus and said, what must I do to inherit eternal life? And Jesus told him some of the commandments. He said, I've been keeping all those. What lack I yet? And Jesus said, go sell everything you have and give it to the poor, and then come and follow me. Now, what about that passage? Why did Christ tell him to sell everything he had and come and follow him? These instructions weren't given to every person. They weren't given to any other individual that we have a record of. The rich that we read about over in the book of 1 Timothy, chapter 6, verses 17 through 19, we might notice concerning them, they weren't told to sell everything they had. Here's what they were told: charge them that are rich in this present world that they be not high-minded, nor have their hope set on the uncertainty of riches, but on God, who giveth us richly all things to enjoy. That they do good, that they be rich in good works, that they be ready to distribute, willing to communicate, laying up in store for themselves a good foundation against the time to come, that they may lay a hold on life, which is life indeed. So notice what they were taught there, what they were told to do. They weren't told to go sell everything and give away all their riches. And he simply told them to use it wisely and to be generous, to be benevolent, to be mindful of those in need. And Jesus, when we read about Jesus, he knew that covetousness was at the heart of the rich young ruler's problem. And he knew that this man was trusting in riches. Anybody that trusts in riches can't go to heaven. That's what Jesus was talking about the impossibility of a camel going through the eye of a needle. If you're trusting in riches, you can't go to heaven, because we put something before God in that case. And you can read about that incident over in Mark chapter 10, beginning at verse 23, about the rich young ruler. And of course, there are those who aren't rich, but they still trust in possessions. There are people who are not rich, but they trust in riches. And they gamble, and they do this and that, trying to get rich quick and find some get-rich-quick scheme. Some of them rob and steal. They're trusting in riches. In either case, you can't enter the kingdom of heaven if you're trusting in riches. Now then, it's important to note here that Jesus did not tell, get this now, Jesus did not tell the rich young ruler to turn his property over to the state and put it in a common fund. He didn't tell him to do that. That's what he would have done if he was trying to promote socialism or communism. He was charged to do, not to do that, but he could spend the money however he wanted to. But in this case, Jesus said, this is what's standing between you and heaven, and you need to get rid of it, whatever that might be. We see other illustrations that Jesus gave like that. If your hand is keeping you from going to heaven, chop it off, and your foot and all of that. That means if something is that important to you that it'll keep you out of heaven, you need to think twice and get rid of the problem. Now, the solution is not going around cutting off people's hands and feet. The solution is self-control, and we understand that. So, that this rich man's property was his is clear from the fact that Jesus told him to sell it. If it wasn't already his, he couldn't sell it, could he? It didn't already belong to the government. It belonged to him, and he had the right to sell it or not sell it. He was charged to do so, not because that was the only economy that the Lord approved. That was not the case. But because in his case, the radical cure for his problem was to get rid of his money, because it was keeping him from heaven. Now, it's doubtful that the socialist governments in several countries, in eliminating the wealth of the rich, are doing that to try to make it easier for those men to go to heaven. I don't think that's their motive in doing that. And we can see that in a lot of cases. And we want to point that out. So when we look at countries like Venezuela and what's going on there, we see it in an extreme case there, where people are trying to flee the country, where people are starving, where all kinds of crime is being committed. It's a terrible thing to see and to behold. And so leadership in situations like that has shown too much trust a lot of times in other countries. Some have trusted in Uncle Sam's riches. If socialism is so great, why do they keep needing help from a country that does not yet claim to be socialist? Well, I think that's a good question to ask. But we want to notice further as we're looking at some of these passages. We mentioned the case of Barnabas in Acts 4 and also of Ananias and Sapphira in Acts 5. But we want to notice further, as we look at some other examples, that there was a special need in Jerusalem. And the Bible tells us in Acts 2, verse 45, that they sold their possessions and goods and parted them to all men as every man had need. A lot of people looked at that passage and said they were practicing communism. Is that really what they were practicing there? First of all, they did not turn it over to a socialist government and let it determine who does or doesn't get help. But now let's ask the question, why was there a special need at that time? No question, it was an emergency situation. Multitudes of people had come to Jerusalem for an annual feast day known as Pentecost, and they had come from every nation under heaven. There are about 15 nations mentioned there in the 2nd chapter of Acts from where they came. And a lot of them, when they got there, before they got there, they didn't realize they were going to be converted to Christianity. And thousands of them were converted, and they stayed there and didn't return to their homes, at least not immediately. And that created a benevolent need, especially for some of the Grecian widows that we read about there in Acts chapter 6. So what we have there, these were people in need, And it was Christian love that motivated them to sell their possessions and help those people, that share with those who had not. They had, and so they gave to those who had not. It was not compulsory, like socialism or communism. It was motivated out of love, not coercion and not by force. That's a big difference in communism and Christianity. So it was love that was the motivating factor there. It wasn't something that the government instituted and forced upon them. It was voluntary, and we need to see that. So you can see all the difference in the world in communism and Christianity when you look at the whole picture. And we hope people will do that and not just get part of it. But the right of private property is expressly declared in the Scriptures in connection with this sharing. They had property that belonged to them, and they made a choice what to do with it, to sell it, and they made a choice to give it. That was all done without coercion. And that right included the right even to keep the proceeds, as we see in the case of Ananias and Sapphira. After it was sold, was it not in thine own power? You could still keep the money, but we know that they lied about what they did there. What we want to notice further, as we look at this, motivated by love, not by force, and that is that this was an affair of the church. It only involved the church. The government was not involved at all in that situation. It wasn't an order of the government. Nobody was disfellowshipped over this, much less killed or his property confiscated by the government, like Castro did to Cuba. And a lot of people had to flee Cuba and came to the United States to live, came to Florida. When that happened, they were property owners, and it was taken away from them. And so it wasn't a matter of selling what they had, it was taken away from them. And it wasn't an effort to place everybody on the same financial level. The Lord doesn't do that. He doesn't try to place everybody on the same level. I guarantee you that when such an attempt is made, it won't apply to those at the top, because that's been the history of those kind of movements who are making the decisions for the rest, that small minority that's making decisions for the rest. They will be exempt, as we have seen in nearly every socialist or communist country or government as well. So what happened there in Acts chapter 2 was for the daily meeting of the needs of various individuals, as every man had need. It says in Acts 2 and verse 45, and also for the daily ministration of the widows. There were certain widows who were in need, and apparently before any kind of government protection for them, it was left up to others to care for them. And so we read in Acts chapter 6 and verse 1 about 7 men being appointed to take care of the needs of the Grecian widows. Now, there's not any evidence that this was a fixed custom, and we see that in other cases. We read later on in the book of Acts in chapter 9 about Dorcas, also known as Tabitha was her name, and she did relief work for individuals. She made garments. She was able to make clothing and blankets and things of that kind. She was full of good works, the Bible says, and she was able to give those to people who had need. They belonged to her. They were free for her to give them away to other people. And it would be impossible to put all that stuff into a common fund. But she simply did good as she wanted to. And so we read about instructions to the churches of Galatia, instructions to the church at Corinth also. Shows individuals had control over their own property and their own profits as well. So they were taught to give on the first day of the week as they were prospered, as they had purposed in their hearts, not according to what the government told them to do. They were to do it cheerfully and not grudgingly, not of necessity. He says in 1 Corinthians 16, 1 and 2, and also in 2 Corinthians 9 in verses 1 through 7. But keep this in mind, under socialism and communism, you don't have that choice. It is of necessity, and the government decides, not you, and they don't care whether you do it cheerfully or not. You still are going to have to pay it, regardless. Now, in the 11th chapter of the book of Acts, and verse 29, we read about another incident concerning the church at Antioch, And it tells about their determination to send relief to the brethren in Judea. And it says, and the disciples, every man according to his ability, determined to send relief unto the brethren that dwelt in Judea, which also they did, sending it to the elders by the hand of Barnabas and Saul. So that's how that was handled. They did it on their own. Nobody compelled them. They were not coerced or forced in any way. And it shows that the disciples in Antioch had their own goods. They belonged to them, and they were not on the same economic level. Each man according to his own ability, it says. We've read about Lydia in Acts chapter 16. She apparently had her own garment business or purple dye. It says she was a seller of purple. She had her own business. She was away from home. And she chose of her own goodwill after her conversion to make her home a base of operations for the apostles and others who were preaching the gospel. She insisted that they live in her house so they'd have a place to stay while they preached the gospel in Philippi. And we know that that was the early beginning of the church in Philippi, which is one of the bright spots in the New Testament. We read later about the Philippian jailer. And then we read about the church at Philippi supporting Paul on his journeys and other places, sending him wages as well. Going back to the Old Testament, we think about the woman in Proverbs chapter 31, the virtuous woman. She had her own garment business. And it says that she makes them and sells them to the merchants. She delivers them to the merchant. She's conducting her own business. She could do that. And so she wasn't under some kind of compulsion by the government in regard to that. I'm sure they all had to pay some taxes. The Bible teaches us to pay our taxes. We're to do that according to the Scriptures. But she used her possessions for good. Now then, if everybody sold all that he had when he became a Christian, we'd all be on relief pretty soon, wouldn't we? If we all sold everything we had. That shows us the Lord didn't intend that, and that's why we read later about Barnabas and Lydia and people like Dorcas. They're still operating. The church wouldn't have any means to continue its work, to meet its needs, if that were the case. So welfare is not a system, but it's the result of a system. And we need to see it that way. Individuals have to have and use a means of production to provide for themselves, to make a profit, in order to be able to give to those who are in need, in order to support the Lord's work through the church, in its evangelism and in its edification and benevolence as well. And we're certainly not against Christians sharing when there is a need. In fact, we encourage that, we promote that, and teach that from the Scriptures. But there is no justification from Acts, the 2nd chapter, for an economic system such as socialism or communism. That's not what takes place there at all. So those systems are not like Christianity in their purpose or in their means which they use to accomplish their purpose. All the difference in the world. One is done out of love, out of the goodness of one's heart, free choice. The other is done out of coercion, by force, and one is forced to do that. So the duty of working and the right to profit from one's labor is clearly taught in the New Testament. We can see that. Wages are a form of private property, and you exchange your wages for certain kinds of property. Labor may be done with the brain. You may have a job where you sit at a computer or at a desk and work all day. You may have a job that involves brawn. It may mean you need to do something physically. And a lot of people would rather do that than to do something sitting behind a desk. People have different preferences. And so they often prepare themselves for certain kinds of work to do that. But the private enterprise system encourages men to work a lot more than some kind of a collectivist society system does that. And it's more in harmony with the demands of Christianity concerning work. Let's notice some of the scriptures here. Ephesians chapter 4, we might notice. We mentioned the Christians in Antioch that had their own goods, and they weren't on the same economic level. But let's notice that a duty to work and profit from labor. Ephesians 4 and verse 28, let him that stole Steal no more, but rather let him labor, working with his hands that which is good, that he may have whereof to give to him that needeth. So the reason we ought to work, not just to provide for ourselves, but to help those who cannot work and who need our help, him that's in need. And don't steal to get that, work to get it. And also you can help the needy by providing a job for them. Boaz did that in the Old Testament for Ruth, and allowed Ruth to be able to work and glean in the fields to provide for her and her mother-in-law, Naomi. Very interesting story in the book of Ruth. In 1 Timothy 5 and verse 8, the Bible says, if any man will not provide for his own, and especially those of his own household, he has denied the faith and is worse than an infidel. So God puts that responsibility on the father, on the head of the house. That includes providing for the aged ones in one's family. We read about the widows there in 1 Timothy 5, earlier in the chapter in verse 4, who may be widows in need. And we also notice that Paul was a tent maker by trade. He was able to work and exchange his labor for money. And he was able to use that money to travel and also to help others. He sometimes labored only to support himself, but also to support others. And he says that in Acts 20, that he supported others at times, in verses 33 and 34. So the fact that the needy were to be helped, like we just read in the Scriptures, didn't mean that the lazy were to be supported. The Scriptures bear out something that we need to notice. The Bible teaches plainly that there are those who are genuinely needy, and they need to be helped. The Bible also teaches that there are some who are genuinely lazy, and he says don't help them. 2 Thessalonians 3 and verse 10 and through verse 12. And it tells us, if a man won't work, neither shall he eat. So the Scriptures emphasize people working and being productive and being able to help others. Paul emphasized what an important matter that was there in 2 Thessalonians in chapter 3. Now then, the system of what we call private enterprise or free enterprise or capitalism does encourage men to be willing to work more so than any other system that's available to us so far. I know that there is no perfect system. I'm not saying that. But it gives less encouragement to those who would be freeloaders, and it's more in harmony with these passages that we've examined tonight, that we looked at in the Scriptures and examined them. We'll go ahead and put the rest of those up there that we mentioned. And we want to point out that that these are things that we need to learn. We need to be aware and realize what is best for Christianity, and we ought to work toward that. Next week, we're going to continue this some more. We're going to talk about oppression. Oppression and the abuse of wealth. We believe that's certainly a timely study, one that we need to consider, and we hope that you've profited from our study tonight. We hope you'll want to continue to study the Word of God, and that you'll want to be in tune with Jesus on some other matters as well, such as being saved. Jesus came for a purpose. He didn't come to be ignored. I often say that. He came for a purpose. He had you in mind when he came. He had me in mind. And he came here and died for us and made available salvation for every man that believes and obeys the gospel. That's what he calls upon us to do. Saul of Tarsus learned this. He left Judaism. He had been persecuting Christians. But when he learned the truth, he asked, what would you have me to do? And the Lord told him to go into the city, and there you'll be told what to do. And he was to ask for Ananias. Ananias, when he got to him, Ananias told him to arise and be baptized and wash away thy sins, calling on the name of the Lord. And it says in Acts 9 and verse 18, he arose and was baptized. He did exactly what the Lord said. We can all obey like that if we want to. Let's get on the same page with Jesus. Let's do his will. Let's follow him from the heart. We thank you so much for listening tonight. Be sure and listen again this coming Sunday morning at 11. We'll be live streaming again at that time, and we hope you'll watch the program at that time. So anything that we can help you with in studying the Bible, learning the truth, feel free to call on us and contact us through our website. Thank you again for listening.